if you're going to give some of these arguments, like I just said, beginning of the universe or whatever, I think most people resonate with those arguments. They can immediately understand something coming into existence must have a cause. They can immediately understand concepts of complexity and design. So the arguments are very powerful because you don't have to do a lot of background massaging of the conversation to get most people to a point where they can appreciate the argument. But then, once the arguments are given, then to try to make the argument about, let's say, well, how do you know this being is good? How do you know it still exists? Why should it be an object of worship? Why do you think it's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Then once you start trying to answer those questions, then you have to start doing some heavy lifting afterwards. With the argument today, it's just sort of the reverse. In my experience, it's very difficult to just go up to somebody and just give them Aquinas' argument. It's just like, we haven't been there for nonsense. That's what it will sound like. So in order to give the argument, you've got to do all the heavy lifting first by saying, well, this is what this means, this is this philosophical concept, this is what that, and you get all the things in place. But I think once the argument is given, all of the classical superlative attributes of God, omniscience, omnipotence, all that, they all just cascade inexorably from that. And you try to help people see. So you do the heavy lifting first, you do the Thomistic, or you have to do it afterwards with the other. I think that's the strengths and weaknesses. So one of my favorite philosophers of the 20th century was Joseph Owens. I call him Uncle Joe, just out of affection. And so he's making reference to the fact that there are other arguments than these rather obtuse-sounding philosophical ones. Those are the other arguments. He says, other arguments may vividly suggest the existence of God, press it home eloquently to human consideration, and for most people provide much greater spiritual and religious aid than difficult metaphysical arguments. But on the philosophical level, these arguments are open to rebuttal and refutation, for they're not philosophically cogent. Well, I'll leave you to decide whether you agree with Uncle Joe or not. So this argument is from the philosopher Thomas Aquinas. Now, you may or may not be familiar with Thomas Aquinas and why he matters. I did my doctoral dissertation on one of his arguments, not really the one I'm giving today, oddly. Actually, if you hear somebody get up to speak and they let out that what they're about to speak on is what their dissertation was on, then run. It's funny, because then they'll get into weeds and all this stuff, and you're like... But let me just give you a little bit of background so you can appreciate it. So Aquinas really stands at a multi-century accumulation of philosophical thinking that goes all the way back to Plato, top left. But his real mentor in philosophy is Aristotle, top right. And my mentor in philosophy, Dr. Norman Geisler, some of you have ever heard of Norman L. Geisler? Did you realize that Dr. Geisler just went to be with the Lord last weekend? So, thank the Lord I was able to rearrange my schedule and fly into Charlotte for the funeral. But a funny kind of side story. So the Geisler family had asked Robbie Zacharias to preach the funeral on the event of Norm's passing. And because Robbie was a student of Norm Geisler. And so Robbie had just landed in Hong Kong when he heard that Dr. Geisler had passed away. So he immediately changed his plans because he was going to go on his speaking circuit, and changed his plan, flew back to the United States, got to Charlotte. The funeral was at 3 p.m. He literally walked into church 5 minutes before 3 and walked right up, having just come in from Hong Kong to the U.S. and preached this just magnificent eulogy. I think it probably is somewhere on the internet because I know it was recorded and streamed on Facebook Live. So if you want to hear just the back, he's magnificent anyway as an eloquent speaker. So who is this Thomas Aquinas, and why is everybody talking about him? Well, he's a 13th century Dominican theologian. He is considered by both critics and enthusiasts to be probably the apex, the zenith. I just wanted to use apex and zenith in the same sentence. So don't try this at home. I am a professional. Don't try to speak too many of those big words. But he is just the very pinnacle of medieval philosophical thinking. And he's often considered that even by his critics. His most famous work that is easily available in English is the sometimes translated in English Summa Theologica, as you see there. More often, Summa Theologia. And it's a 5-volume. It's funny when people read it, it is so deep and technical. But at the beginning he says, okay, I just wrote this for beginners in theology. That's in his mind it was for beginners. And so the reason I bring it up is because he is most famous for, and if you ever run into Thomas Aquinas in just an introductory textbook on philosophy, you're always going to hear about his 5 ways. So his 5 ways are his 5 famous arguments for God's existence. One of those arguments is the argument from motion. The argument from efficient causality is the one that I did my dissertation on. But you see the argument from being, the argument from degrees of perfection, the argument from final causality. So those are his famous 5 ways. But another resource that he's famous for is his Summa Contradictivities. This was basically, it's about 6 volumes, but it's a lot smaller footprint. And it's a lot easier to read. It was written more or less as an apologetic book for Christians when they encountered the Muslims. So it's written with the Muslims in mind of trying to argue, especially for the Christian doctrine, because the Christians and the Muslims would agree on a lot of things philosophically about the nature of God. The argument I'm going to give you here is from the only thing Aquinas wrote that was purely philosophical. All of his other writings are theological, out of which you can distill his philosophy, or they're commentaries on other philosophers like Aristotle, or they're commentaries on books of the Bible. And there's also commentaries he's done on some of the church fathers. The only thing that I'm aware of that he wrote that was a purely philosophical treatise is this book titled On Being and Essence, and sometimes referred to in the Latin as De Ente et Essentia. You'll see that sometimes in not even translated. It's a little tiny book you could read in probably 20 minutes. Now, just to give you a perspective on how he compares in terms of his contribution, we've all heard of Plato. If you leave it out too long, it gets real hard. No, that's good. Plato. Plato wrote, the extant works of Plato about 500,000 words. Plato's famous pupil, Aristotle, he wrote about 1,000,000 words, at least in the extant materials. Thomas Aquinas wrote about 80 million words, just to give you a comparison. Now, what you can get from the slides, the 2 reasons you want this to get the PDF of the PowerPoint, because a lot of slides are hidden. So you can get the PDF and get the hidden slides. Or there may be a citation that I give that goes by too fast. I read it, go to the next slide. You can see where that was. Go get the PDF and you can find where it is. In there I do things like compare and contrast Aristotle and Aquinas, where they're similar and where they're different. For the sake of time, I'm not going to do that. You don't really care, probably anyway. It is relevant overall to the question of God's existence in his argument, but I think we can introduce any relevancy along the way that'll get us there. So, what is the argument? Well, all of Aquinas' arguments demonstrate not that there is a cause of the universe beginning to exist, but that there is a cause of the universe's current existing. Now that ought to strike, that's not the right word. I suspect that strikes most people as an odd kind of thing. Most people don't think in terms of that the chair I'm on has to continually be caused to exist at every instant of its existence. So we'll come back to what he thinks that means and why he thinks it means that. So his arguments then, because of that, are indifferent as to whether the universe ever began to exist. It doesn't matter. Now, he certainly believed the universe began to exist, but he believed it because he thought it was taught by revealed truth, Genesis 1:1. So he believed that. He just didn't think that it could be demonstrated philosophically. I think that actually can, like the Kalam argument. But be that as it may, he didn't. And for that matter, he's like, well, it doesn't matter. Even if the universe is eternal, my argument still shows there has to be a God who is sustaining it in existence. Now, he employs a number of philosophical doctrines, and we'll say only enough about each one, hopefully, that the argument will make sense. And then you can go back and do some background research. But he uses things like essence, and you can kind of get a clue that it was going to include that. That's the title of the talk, right? What is an essence? Existence. The Latin word for existence is the infinitive esse. The Latin verb to be is sum, S-U-M. The infinitive form is esse. It means to be. More often than not translated into English as a noun, existence, because it's translated as a to be. We're going to talk about the to be of God. What? That doesn't make sense. But just realize that infinitive is a verbal noun. It has kind of a nounish sense to it, but it has kind of an action sense to it at the same time. And of course, then the distinction between the two, whatever that means. So let's begin to unpack then what this distinction is.